Hello, everyone. Welcome in. We're just going to give everybody a few minutes to join and get comfortable in Zoom land, and then we'll start the event in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Yes. Welcome, everybody. As Mia just pointed out, you are in the building. We're going to give people a few minutes. My name is Devarian Baldwin, proud member of Scholars of Social Justice. You are a part of the conversation called Under Attack. So just take a minute, get your popcorn, get your drink, get your pillow, whatever you need, your notepad, whatever keeps you going in these webinars. This is going to be exciting. This is not be your typical webinar. So just give us a minute or two and we will begin in about 3 minutes. Thank you. The numbers are slowly creeping up. We have about 200 people registered. You'll be happy to have half of that. So everybody who's still coming in, welcome. We will be getting started in a few minutes. Thanks for being here for our conversation called Under Attack. Just a reminder, this is Scholars Social Justice, our webinar called Under Attack. We're going to start in about 1 minute. So welcome everybody. People still coming in. We'll give people another minute to come in. We'll get started in 1 minute. Thank you. Okay, everybody. Greetings, and welcome to Under Attack, Fighting the Assaults on Black Queer and Black Feminist Studies, a conversation. This conversation is sponsored by Scholars for Social Justice, almighty SSJ. We've been doing it for a minute. We've been doing these webinars. We know what we're doing. We got a pattern to this. And this particular webinar, Under Attack, is a part of the National Day of Action. And this is our small contribution to the convenings happening all over the country in national conversation, primarily sponsored by the African American Policy Forum. So this is our small contribution. So we welcome you and thank you for joining us again for Under Attack, Fighting the Assault on Black Queer and Black Feminist Studies, a conversation. This again is being sponsored by SSJ. So Scholars for Social Justice was founded to create space for radical and progressive scholars to engage, agitate, and organize outside of the formal and often stifling context of the academy. Our main goal was to also be in conversation with and in service to racial and social justice movements. We are deeply committed to the ongoing struggle against white supremacy and white nationalism in their blatant and insidious forms, which is why the leadership and founders of SSJ were scholars of color and primarily Black women scholars. So that Black and brown agency and leadership did not become an afterthought. Now we realize there are rich reservoirs of knowledge outside the academy. So we also welcome unaffiliated and independent scholars, researchers, and educators into our ranks. We also realize that the university is not just faculty. Therefore, we are eager to work with students, campus workers, and those in the communities adjacent to our campuses. Our first project a few years ago was a national working group on reparations in higher education. Our current focus is on abolition and reparations projects that center on, but extend beyond university campuses, work led by members and friends of SSJ. For this work, we are operating under the rubric of ARIS, abolition, reparations, investment, and safety. We have a number of exciting programs, events, convenings. We have our Leaf Mullings Social Justice Salon that some of you may be familiar with. We have workshops, and be on the lookout for other convenings and programming. But for tonight we have one of our founding directors of SSJ convening this conversation Under Attack. That is none other than Kathy Cohen. Kathy Cohen is a Black queer feminist activist and the inaugural chair of the Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity at the University of Chicago. She is the author and co-editor of numerous texts and articles, including Democracy Remixed, Black Youth and the Future of American Politics, The Boundaries of Blackness, AIDS and the Breakdown of Black Politics, a classic, and Punks, Bulldaggers, and Welfare Queens, The Radical Potential of Queer Politics. So now I want to offer the stage to Kathy Cohen, who will introduce the panelists for Under Attack. Thanks so much, Kathy.
Thanks, Devarian. Thank you for the introduction to SSJ, and my own introduction. I am so excited to engage in this conversation with these kind of brilliant panelists. But before we get there, I want to welcome everyone who is joining us this evening, and for folks who will watch this on the webinar later. We are happy, as Devarian said, to be in alignment with this National Day of Action that is a part of the Freedom to Learn movement hosted by the African American Policy Forum. Scholars for Social Justice so appreciate your participation and responding to yet another defining characteristic of this political moment, namely the attacks on ideas, on speech and truth, as it relates to kind of marginalized and racialized communities, and really the liberatory knowledge production of Black feminism and Black queer studies. It seems that literally every day, those on the right are drafting and sometimes passing more legislation that curtails investigation, discussion, and the teaching of subject matter related to racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness, with such efforts portrayed as a necessary kind of corrective to what they call, or what we used to call, woke ideology, and the recentering of parents as central decision makers in the education of their children. Now, evidence of these efforts to kind of silence discussions of race, racism, and white supremacy were highlighted in a recent study by scholars at UCLA and UC San Diego, where the researchers found that in 2020 and 2021, nearly 900 school districts across the United States, representing 35% of all K through 12 students had been affected by local district versions of an intentional campaign to restrict or ban what opponents have caricatured as critical race theory. Now, undoubtedly, the most public display of the attack on teaching about racism, anti-Blackness, and white supremacy is the concerted assault coming out of the state of Florida. And most notoriously has been the state's refusal to accept an African-American studies AP curriculum unless some topics, right, such as Black feminism, Black queer studies, intersectionality, and much of the readings around movements were censored from the curriculum. Now, I'm pointing out the curriculum not only to talk about Florida, but to remind us that, yes, we have to be focused on those on the right, but we also have to be understanding and focused on kind of liberal collaborators like the AP curriculum and the College Board. And while it would be easy or easier to limit our concern, for example, to Florida, suggesting, right, that the rest of the country remains whatever, I'm not sure, level-headed about the centrality of race and racism, right, to an understanding of the past and the present of the country, we should be clear that such a limited understanding of this threat is naive. In fact, political scientist John Mark Hansen wrote that over the past 2 years, 18 GOP-controlled states have passed laws that prohibit or restrict the teaching of something that they're calling critical race theory. I also want to remind us that these bills are not limited to K through 12 education. They include and they seek to limit what is taught, discussed, and debated in higher education. And while attention to the limitations imposed on the teaching of racism and white supremacy is kind of challenging enough, I don't want us to forget the devastating and dangerous all-out attacks on the lesbian, gay, and especially trans rights and knowledge production happening throughout this country. Right? For example, the ACLU is tracking up 188 schools and education bills that they deem will cause harm for LGBT people if passed. So tonight we are going to be in conversation with an amazing group of activist scholars to help us think through what is happening and what we must do. And I have the honor of introducing this panel. First, I want to introduce Jessie Hagopian, who is a high school teacher in Seattle, an editor for Rethinking Schools magazine, and the author of the forthcoming book from Haymarket Books, Teach Truth, The Attacks on Critical Race Theory and the Struggle for Anti-Racist Education. Jessie is also a founding member of Black Lives Matter at School, a campaign organizer for the Zen Education Project's Teaching Black Lives campaign, editor of the book More Than a Score, The New Uprisings Against High Stakes Testing, and the co-editor of Teachers Unions and Social Justice, Organizing the Schools and Communities Our Students Deserve. Thank you, Jessie, for being here.
Oh, appreciate you. Thanks so much for having me.
Fantastic. Next is the amazing Sarah Haley, who is an associate professor of gender studies and history at Columbia University, and the author of just an amazing book, No Mercy Here, Gender, Punishment, and the Making of Jim Crow Modernity. Prior to arriving at Columbia, she worked as a paralegal and as an organizer with the Hospitality Workers Union, Unite Here, and was the founding director of the Black Feminism Initiative at UCLA. She currently organizes with Scholars for Social Justice. Finally, and it can never be finally, is Jafari Sinclair Allen, who is a professor of African American Studies and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. His most recent book is There's a Disco Ball Between Us, A Theory of Black Gay Life, published by Duke University Press in 2022, and he has other texts that I would direct you to. Professor Allen is also the new editor of Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. So please join me in welcoming these amazing friends, scholars, and interlocutors tonight. All right, people, I wanna start. We don't have a lot of time, so I wanna start with a question. And maybe Jessie, I'm gonna start with you, but who else wants to join in would be fantastic. So thinking about, many of the attacks I just outlined, and you could add to that if you want to, why do we think this coordinated series of attacks are happening at this particular political moment, right? Is it about, for example, the mobilization and resistance that we saw in 2020? Is it, as some people say, just a culture war to distract white voters from their kind of eroding relationship to power and privilege? How might we begin to understand this particular moment?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And for Scholars for Social Justice for organizing this. I really look forward to learning from you all on this panel today. And I think that we are certainly in an era of great contradictions. In the boundless satire that is the United States of America, we have a situation where Juneteenth, the oldest commemoration of ending slavery, became a federal holiday at the same time that legislators were passing laws to make it a crime to teach about the origins of this commemoration in many states, including in Texas, where the holiday originates. So this land of the free refrain, I think, continues to take on new and intricate shades of mockery, as many educators have been fired for teaching the truth about structural racism. And I would argue that there are 4 primary reasons for the current attack on teaching about structural racism in our schools. I think first, it is a backlash to the 2020 uprising. I think it's also an electoral strategy of the Republican Party. I think it's also a strategy of neoliberal privatization of public schools. And I think it's also something much deeper than that, an attempt to erase systems of thought altogether. And I'll just briefly outline what I mean by these attacks. I think, the immediate impetus for the attacks on truthful education happened after the largest uprising in US history, perhaps, with the 2020 movement for Black Lives. According to Education Week, a survey they conducted in June of 2020, 81% of principals and teachers and district leaders indicated that they supported the movement for Black Lives. And this was terrifying to racists everywhere, right? And because of the uprising, educators, often spurred by their students, were increasingly engaging in lessons about racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and all the ways they try to divide and conquer us. And the irony, of course, is that by attacking critical race theory, the right was proving one of the central points of critical race theory, that any advances in struggles against racism will be met with a white supremacist backlash. I think it's clearly an election strategy. We saw that in the midterms, the way they tried to claim that white children were being shamed and being taught to hate their own families, and using that as a way to mobilize the base of the GOP to the polls. I think those are the ones that are discussed the most in the media, but I think we have to understand the push towards neoliberal privatization as well. This isn't just one election cycle that the GOP is trying to capture. They want to capture the entire institution of education and privatize it. And this has actually been a bipartisan project. Democrats and Republicans have long forged a consensus around corporate education reform, both parties agreeing that we should reduce teaching and learning to a single score on a standardized test, and then use that test to punish schools and then turn them into charter schools, or push for vouchers. And, I think now the right is just taking it farther, right? Now they're going to the extreme with this opportunity to try to push white families out of the schools, claiming that they are indoctrinating their kids with critical race theory, and get them to try to grab public funds to go to private schools. But I'll just end by saying that I think the larger reason for this attack on truthful education has to do with the forces of colonization and white supremacy that have long attempted to obliterate the ability of people to even imagine a better world and any systems of thought that would help achieve that world have been attacked over and over again. And you know, this process of epistemicide, right? The killing, silencing, or annihilation of entire systems of knowledge has been part of the colonization project, right? We can look back to the conquistadors who arrived and met the Mayans and actually took every single one of their books, all but 4, and lit them on fire and incinerated one of the most advanced bodies of knowledge anywhere in the world, right? We could look at the way epistemicide was perpetrated with the mandatory illiteracy laws for enslaved African people brought to the Americas, or how during Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacists burned down over 600 Black schools, trying to erase any system of knowledge that could help lead to liberation, or the Native American boarding schools, right? Or the mass layoffs of Black educators after Brown versus Board of Education. I think there are just so many examples of how they've tried to eradicate any system of knowledge that will help us get free. And so I think, seen in this light, the current legislative bans on teaching any method of analyzing structural racism aren't just a re-election tactic. These new laws are really also about epistemicide.
Jesse, that was fantastic. I was sitting here kind of taking in your knowledge, thinking, why didn't I have you as a teacher at some point, or a teacher like you when I was in high school? You know, thank you for breaking that down. And I don't know if others want to respond or something, but I'm going to try to both allow for space of response, but also move us through a series of questions. So are we okay? We'll come back. Thank you for setting up that framework for us. Sarah, I'm gonna pivot towards you, and I'm wondering if you might talk about the significance of Black feminism as a target of of these attacks. In particular, I'm wondering if you might talk about the kind of battle historically to center Black feminism as a kind of central framework to understand the struggle and liberation of Black people. So when some people say, why should Black feminism be included in the teaching of Black studies? I'm wondering what your response would be.
Yeah, first, thank you for this question, and thank you for convening this and organizing this, Kathy. The answer to this question, there's so many answers, but one of them relates to the previous question, which is that we're still living in the era of Anita Hill, right? And so, when you think of who the president is and who, is on the Supreme Court and a kind of idol among the right, and particularly the way you set us up, Kathy, and thinking about this as a complicated political context in which there is a right-wing attack and also liberal collusion among people who, we would assume might know better or act better or whatever. I think that that kind of political context comes together when we think about a macro political framework of the fight around Anita Hill and the struggle around Anita Hill. And of course, that was a battle in which Black feminists insisted on a different kind of political discourse and the centering of gender violence and the centering of interlocking, intersectional modes of oppression and power as critical to that historical moment and that political moment. But so, I'm thinking about why now? Well, why now? Because there's clearly a fight that is a legacy of earlier fights. But I also think about why now in terms of the kinds of questions that are being occluded, not just in the secondary analysis, but as a Black feminist historian, I think about the project of Black feminist history as being one that asserts that you can't separate analysis from fact. You can't separate narrative from experience. You can't separate a story from data, right? And so that kind of framework and scaffolding of history, of course, has to be attacked, and it has to be attacked under the guise of objectivity. That is always, right, the foil. But, you know, in this case, it's such a thin foil, you know, it's so like apparent that you wonder how anyone can even articulate it. But, you know, I just had to take a look at the curriculum and thinking about these questions. And, you know, I said, okay, well, you know, of course, they have to include Ida B. Wells, right? They have to. Under this rubric of just the facts, ma'am, we're going to teach the straight up history, a history of leadership, you know, history of icons and celebrated figures, which of course, brilliant scholars like Erica Edwards and Hazel Carby have challenged, right, as the way to think about history. I said, well, what must they be saying about Ida B. Wells? And, you know, they include a red record, one of her seminal texts. But they argue that, you know, what Ida B. Wells asserted was that lynching is a role to thwart any kind of Black advancement. And that is like the learning objective, right? So there are objectives, which belie a notion that this is just a presentation of history, right? There's that is a framing. So there is a framing. And for Ida B. Wells, the framing is, you know, a generalized notion of Black advancement. And it's like any Black feminist, any Black queer scholar of Wells, of which there are many, right, will tell you that what Ida B. Wells did in her brilliance, for which she was exiled under censorship, which makes it, of course, ironic, right, that they are erasing much of her intervention. But what she is arguing is that constructions of racialized gender and racialized sexuality are being proliferated as a way of marginalizing and thwarting Black political prospects, right? But it's the specificity of kind of ideas about racialized sexuality, pathologized Black sexuality that is erased, right, in this, which was obviously one of Ida B. Wells' central interventions. So it's that kind of a history that would, you know, present civil rights in such a way where you don't get to hear from someone like Diane Nash, who was in prison in 1962 when she was pregnant. And she said that, you know, every Black child, unless she fought against segregation, every Black child would be born in jail. That is a framework of analysis about reproduction, about the possibilities and what the stakes of the civil rights movement were. And this is from one of the main organizers and architects of civil rights strategy. And so you see both marginalization and exclusion in very specific ways that represent a marketing campaign for children around racialized and gender normativity that, you know, really reflect a longstanding struggle around Black feminism and Black feminism's analysis of Black liberation and power and anti-Black violence. And, you know, it's just so disturbing to see this kind of collusion around that. And that collusion, I'll just end by saying, is both a marginalization and erasure. So you don't hear from people like Johnny Lee Tillman or the National Welfare Rights Organization, because one of the consistent through lines of Black feminism is around the relationship between racial capitalism and gender oppression and sexual oppression, right? And that is embodied in a figure like Johnny Lee Tillman, who is a brilliant analyst and a figure in Black power, whose organization, the National Welfare Rights Organization, had a large membership, right? And so it's just wanna like meditate on the obviousness, right? And the ways in which this exclusion of Black feminism just reveals the violence of the political project.
Amazing, fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, between you, Jesse, oh, this is very rich. And I just want to highlight the ways in which erasure that you mentioned, that erasure is not just the absence of individuals, but the kind of truncating of the analysis of liberation that Black feminism is putting forward for us. And so thank you for that. All right, I'm going to ask Jafari to jump in now. And Jafari, I'm going to ask you to do something similar to the question. I'm going to pose a question similar to what I just posed to Sarah, which is to ask you specifically, how would you center Black queerness and Black queer studies in the discussion of Black people and Black liberation? One of the things I noted was when DeSantis tried to kind of dismiss how ridiculous the AP course on Black studies was that was presented. He sarcastically asked, who thinks Black queer studies is an important topic of study? And I will say there are some who try to respond by offering up individuals who we would now, or some would now claim as queer, right? Well, Audre Lorde is queer, and so Audre Lorde's important, so Black queerness must be important. I'm not sure Audre Lorde is queer, but so I'm wondering what you would say about, or how you think about the centrality of Black queer studies and Black studies to kind of a Black liberatory project, and maybe start with, what do you mean by Black queer studies or Black queerness?
Well, I think I want to begin with, Sarah has already begun some of this, right? And you mentioned the truncation of the analysis and the importance of the framing, right? So, when I heard that, I thought that there should have been a pause when DeSantis said, who? I'm like, well, leading scholars of Black studies think this, and not for the reasons that you may think, because of these glittering queer folks of the past, many of whom would never say that they were queer or gay or lesbian, but in our rethinking, we have done that. But I think that it's important to center and to think about LGBTQ studies, queer studies, not simply for the fact that Black people come in queer, and that we're part of communities and have contributed to those communities, but also because of the questions, right? Because of the framing. So some of the questions that any project of Black freedom or liberation should ask have been refined in Black queer studies, like, what is a community? Who belongs to that community? Under what circumstances can someone be excluded from that community? And then, are those answers historically consistent? Do we think of gay or lesbian or bisexual, transgender, all of these terms, the same way that we thought about them 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago? What has changed? How are people regarded within those communities? These are all questions that queer studies frames and then reframes for us, and can really be a great tool in classrooms. And it has been in mine, and not even necessarily in a queer studies or a Black queer studies context, but in the context of critical thinking, to ask people to question received wisdom with and up against other narratives, right? But you asked me about how I see Black queer studies, and I see it as part of the longer Black intellectual radical tradition, which Black studies comes out of, and what gives Black studies its why. And so, now we have folks like Sarah and I, who and you, Kathy, and Devarian, who get a paycheck from an institution, and in order to do that, there are certain hoops that one has to go through. And all of your work is fantastic and important and essential to the project of Black studies. And yet we also recognize that it comes out of a context where the folks who invented it were people who are autodidacts, people who may not have walked by a university, people who did the scholarship that they did because they were part of and wanted to advance a project of Black liberation or Black uplift, which are different, which are different projects, right? But all related. And that Black queer studies comes out of this tradition and can be traced to projects of the 1970s, initiated by Black lesbian feminists. That's lesbian with a big L. We can talk about that later. Black lesbian feminists who were, again, not paid academics. They were scholars and organizers, activists, writers, creative people who, again, were focused on a liberation project. So we know the story, or many people know the story about the uprisings in the late 1960s that bring us Black studies in universities. And we also know other parts of that story about organizations, philanthropic organizations that had their own reasons, right? So Black studies is a complex project. Black queer studies is also a complex project, but one that, if we think about its utility in the classroom, its utility in the classroom K through 12, in high schools, and in some cases in other K through 12 contexts, and its utility in our classrooms at the higher education level, it is always, for me, a chance for students, no matter what their own identity, positions, or their feelings about an issue, to be confronted with those questions about belonging. And I just have to say, I was thinking as Jesse was speaking so eloquently about the fact that all of these, the why now is not just either or, but so many different pieces of this. I just have to speak on this as a part-time Floridian, right? That it's evident to me that DeSantis is using this to activate a really base, right? That Trump showed was not only lucrative, right? Which I think is the main thing. So the main thing is it is lucrative. That the moment these issues come up, there are dollars going to campaigns and to organizations. That's the first thing, right? And that this base is active. They're everywhere, and then it's often effective, right? And so when the governor of Florida makes these statements, he's making them rhetorically in order to activate this stuff. But the reason that he is more dangerous than Trump in many cases is because this is not just bluster, but these are actually being enacted and executed in the state of Florida, right? And so he may be, in this case, out-trumping Trump. And so it's evident to me that this is not a drill, right? But it's a rehearsal for not only a national campaign, but implementing this around the country, as you've already pointed out, 188 different bills in formation, et cetera. And what we think of as a tiny subset of a subfield of Black studies and Black queer studies is, in fact, at the center of these controversies. And I think that it's important for us to speak to them and to also continue to do our work to ask those essential questions, which Black queer studies has always done.
Thank you. So I want to do two things. I want a little bit of a follow-up with you and maybe Sarah, but I want to encourage folks, if you have questions, to add them to the question and answer. And I promise we will get to them in the next 5 to 10 minutes, even though I have 7 more questions. We are not going to get to all the questions, which is, it is this kind of, and my follow-up is to say that part of the argument about DeSantis picking out, in particular, Black queer studies, is that it has a uneasy position in relationship to Black people, right? And the support of Black people, right? It is a leverage, right? Point, some people would say. And I guess I'd like your thoughts about, the reality of that, and what does it mean in terms of how we should think about I don't know, Black queer studies centrality to Black people versus Black queer studies centrality to a Black studies and Black radical tradition, and just to tease those out a bit.
Absolutely. See, I just saw Sarah's face and she was like, well, I'm glad she didn't ask me that question. So I'm going to get back to you, Sarah, because this is a fraught question. And I just want to, I'm not backing out of the question, but I want to tie this to another piece of this that I know you wanted to get to, Kathy, was the focus on trans communities. Because my answer to this is similar, right? So why a focus on trans? Because they had already seen how we sold out trans people over and over and over again. And so that area becomes a really a soft target, right? As if they've already seen through history the way that the LGB movement, scholarship and activism is willing to turn their backs, right? Likewise, I think that the expectation is that upstanding, middle-class, respectable Black studies scholars will say, well, yes, we want to defend Black studies, but we want to defend, the clean, we want to defend the clean, non-sexual, non-feminist, non-queer Black studies. And I think that this is one of their miscalculations. And I think the miscalculation is that they had not recognized the fact that over the past 20 or so years, the most vital, urgent, cited scholarship, much of it has come from these sites, and that our students are those who are on the front, from high school through post-grad, are on the front lines of these questions in the street, not only in higher education. And so this time, I think, I hope, I pray, they have miscalculated that wide gulf, that traditional, really wide gulf between Black folks, for example, who understand who their cousins are, who understand who is in the community and who is not in the community, and those of us who have taken on the responsibility of describing those communities and describe them in ways that are perhaps less colorful, less diverse, less fraught with these tensions, and have presented a version of us that looks like the civil rights movement, with everyone with their pearls and purses on a picket line, as opposed to that plus all the other modes of resistance and of aliveness that we have in Black communities. And so I think that this is one of the centers of how we move forward, is to double down on that, to recognize and assert ourselves in these conversations, and to continue to teach our students to ask these questions, whether our students be people in our classrooms at, not only neoliberal institutions, but for those of us on this panel at elite institutions, but those we teach outside of the classroom, and our support for K through 12 teachers who are in the formation of minds very before they get to us, many of whom will never get to us.
Now, before I turn to questions and answers, I'm glad people are populating that. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll just try and jump in really quick, because Jafari, that was really helpful in the sense of thinking about how the right-wing culture wars have turned out in ways that they didn't expect. You look at abortion, right? Like, they didn't expect for people to actually people to actually come out in full support of abortion rights. And And so I just think about, I'm not a political scientist, but I do think that, Kathy, your framework around queerness as a position in relationship to power is crucial here when you think about how the last election was won. I mean, I know that, you know, one of my very close friends, Stephanie, was like, I don't know if we won this, but we knocked on 5 million doors in the last 2 weeks or whatever it was. And those were working class Black women who had a certain critique around economics, race, and gender, in which abortion was mobilizing, but it was mobilizing in a larger context around educational opportunities, around jobs, around unions. And so I do feel like there is a broader context in which to think about what Black queerness means and what the right wing is afraid of. And I think between a kind of like avowed Black queer leadership of Black Lives Matter and Black queer feminism, right, being mobilizing around youth and BYP 100 and all sorts of organizations, right, and that being present, I imagine that it's, I'm hopeful that it's less a reality and more an anxiety, right, among the right wing around what Black politics looks like today.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn it over to Jesse to jump in on this one, or, you know, whatever you want to say. And then I'm going to try to take us to the question and answers, or questions, and then you all will give the answers. You got to take yourself off mute, Jesse.
Thank you. Right on, y'all. I've just been learning so much. I appreciate the contributions so far. And, you know, as a high school teacher, I teach my students about Black feminism because it's been one of the most generative sources of struggle in US history. And it's really been the propeller of broader Black freedom struggles. You know, from before Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" to, you know, as you were just touching on, Sarah, the founding of the Black Lives Matter movement by Black women and Black queer women. And I think despite both the far right and the liberals at the College Board, you just can't teach an honest account of Black history without teaching these principles of Black feminism. And if we're going to teach the truth about Black history, we have to include the contributions of Black women like Claudia Jones, leader in the Communist Party, who theorized about super exploitation. And that's a concept I want my students to know about, you know, or the Combahee River Collective and their idea of interlocking oppressions, right? These are things that are basic to understanding US history, understanding social movements, and can't be separated out. And that's why I think the work that we're doing in Black Lives Matter at school is really critical. You know, we've taken an intersectional approach. Tamara Anderson in Philadelphia broke down the 13 principles of the Black Lives Matter Global Network and applied them to each day of the week for our week of action. And that's now guides the country every year. The first week of February, there's thousands of teachers across the country teaching about trans affirming, queer affirming, collective value, Black women. Like, these are the principles that are guiding the movement. And it's actually really exciting to see principles of intersectionality at the heart of a new freedom struggle that's emerging in this country right now.
Okay. I'm going to turn us to the questions that are being asked. I really thank you. Let me read through. I'll take one, and then somebody can answer, and we'll keep going. What do you all think Black queer studies affords us in conversations about Black futurity? I never say that right. And freedom dreaming. Freedom dreaming. Oh, it's a long day. Did you all understand the question? Does anybody want to take a?
I think so. One thing is that Black queer studies is in fact itself an instantiation of freedom dreaming and possibilities and queer futurity. It's for another panel, but you know, Black queer studies, we're not quite there yet, and we're not even quite sure we would want to stay there if we were there. Right. So in terms of futurity, it is speculative. It is, we're making it up as we go along. It is, perhaps it was a dream dreamt before, but perhaps this is a nightmare. You know, this actually, the Black queer studies may be the nightmare of the folks from the 70s and 80s who wanted Black liberation. And didn't ask for us to be sitting somewhere studying something. They wanted something else, right? Perhaps what they wanted was somebody like Mr. Hagopian, which I'm not going to call Jesse because I want to imagine him as my teacher, right? So what would it be like, you know, for me to be in junior high school, you know, at the end of the last century and have learned about Claudia Jones then, as opposed to in graduate school? I mean, so that's the sort of Black futurity, sort of speculative thing that Black queer studies might. That's the way to reframe that question, to throw it back to say we're thinking through how the past and the future, the past and the present can refract for our imagination of something to come.
Great. We have two additional questions. I'm going to try to ask you all to answer them in 2 minutes or less, each one. So the first one is, what should we think about / consider amidst the attacks on Black queer feminist studies and theories, yet the simultaneous whitewashing and bastardization by nonprofits of radical theories and concepts such as mutual aid? Everybody got that one? Anybody want to try?
I'll just jump in, and I'm very moved by, Jesse, your account of education and what's fundamental. So I just want to thank you. I haven't had a chance to do that so far. But, you know, we are in part of what I think the framework of this session was, with Kathy arguing that this is a right-wing attack, but it's also an attack around a kind of normativity and liberalism, is this question of nonprofits and incorporation, the incorporation of iconography, of Black women, of representative politics without the critique of power. And I think you see that in all facets of social and political life. And I think the curriculum is precisely like the instantiation of this question of, let's have some representation. And this is, you know, also what nonprofits are doing in a kind of less a grassroots organizing struggle and a nonprofit industrial complex organizing struggle of like, let's have mutual aid programs or direct services without organizing. Let's have representation without analysis, right? Incorporation is so crucial to this neoliberal moment. And Black feminists and Black queer figures are central to that project, that I think we just have to really name that and really be attentive and on guard around the mobilization of people really against their wills, right? Against their historical wills. Audre Lorde would have wanted none of this, right? So.
Perfect. Last question, and I might add a question I had onto this. So first of all, they start by saying, so grateful to all for this incredible event. I wonder if you all might reflect on these questions of the attack on Black feminist and queer and trans life in relation to this renewed moment of labor organizing. And I might say also in relationship to this, I don't want to say broader, an attack in a different domain that would restrict or end, for example, tenure, that would prohibit scholars, professors, graduate students from organizing. We've seen that in Ohio, we've seen that in Texas. So how might all of this fit together, or do we understand it as contradiction that we have these attacks, but also we have this mobilization of labor organizing?
Yeah, I really appreciate this question, so I thought I'd jump in on it. You know, being from Seattle, I'm particularly excited about the Starbucks workers organizing and fighting for a living wage across the country. But, you know, the Amazon workers and as well, and the wave of teacher strikes that have happened across the country, as well. You know, the teachers in Chicago Teachers Union have long inspired me and in LA and beyond. And we are seeing an uptick in labor organizing. And I think that is one of the reasons why that elites today are bringing back the playbook of McCarthyism, because that was the playbook they used to smash the labor movement. They said that the Red Scare was about finding communists, but in fact, we know that the vast majority of those who were persecuted were people engaged in the Black freedom movement and in the labor movement as well. And, you know, all too often the Red Scare is talked about, but what's overlooked is the Lavender Scare that happened simultaneously and overlapped with it. So you had between 1957 and 1963, the state of Florida led a homophobic crusade against queer school teachers that resulted in interrogating, firing, and revoking their teaching certificates. And this is the playbook that DeSantis is using. So you know, by 1963, this investigation committee had revoked licensures for 71 teachers and had another 63 that they had identified as suspects, right? As suspected of being LGBTQ plus, right? And so we see the way that they use oppression to divide and conquer, to smash the social movements. And that's what they did. And it took the civil rights movement, it took the Black Power movement and you know, the feminist movement of the 50s, 60s, 70s to finally break through that stultifying political atmosphere of the McCarthy movement. And I think we're at the same kind of crossroads today. We will either return to an era like McCarthyism, maybe on steroids, or we will have a new era of the Black freedom movement break through that. And that's the question that's posed to us today.
Okay, I don't want to let you all go, but I know I have to. So we have about 1 minute before we turn it back to DeVarian. I know I see you, Sarah. Do you all want to say 30 seconds in response to Jesse, or just about what is needed at this moment? So Sarah, you want to go?
Yeah, sorry, this isn't what is needed, but I want to thank Durba, who's a brilliant sexuality studies scholar and activist, for that question. And just to say, to add on to what Jesse said, which is so important, and to note that, you know, what Red Scares and repression always also required was violence. And so the modes of social control around trans children in this moment is such a deep deployment of violence, that I really think of it as that strand of a broader or organizing control. You have young people who are questioning capitalism itself, questioning jobs, questioning labor conditions, questioning gender. And this is one of the most violent mobilizations of that overall repression of movements. So I just wanted to name that.
Jafari.
Thank you. Just a couple of seconds in terms of what's needed. It's obvious from this conversation that what's needed is more, not only conversation, but coordination of folks across across different modes of teaching and learning. I've learned quite a lot. Learned quite a lot today, and I'm thinking about the fact of not being distracted by these eruptions, but also understanding that we can't all put out every fire, but with coordination, we can get to it a lot more effectively. So I hope to be a part of more of that as we continue. And thank you.
No, thank you, Jafari. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jesse. This was so enlightening. Hopefully it will move people to understand that this is a moment that we have to move. We have to be in movement formation. We have to understand these threats, not as some cultural war, but an opportunity really to move a kind of Black radical tradition and a liberatory framework forward. We are under attack, but we always rise, we always resist, we always mobilize. And on that note, I want to thank people again for joining Scholars for Social Justice and turn it back over to DeVarian.
Woo, woo. Okay, fire burning. This was real. I really appreciate this amazing conversation between Jafari, Jesse, Sarah, and Kathy. We are really blessed to have you all a part of the SSJ family. We want y'all to be more part of the SSJ family, and people that are in the audience, we want you also to be more part of the SSJ family. We have a new website, thank God. We back up, we out here after a little bit of a hiatus. So we asked in the chat, you'll see a link to the website. Also, Mia will put in the chat a Google form link that will allow you to become a member or to upgrade your membership to a higher level of commitment. Hint, hint. So we are happy to have you all a part of this conversation. Jesse, Jafar, we consider you, if we know y'all members and family, part of SSJ, and we thank you for doing the work that you do. We thank people in the audience. Sarah, we long been a family member, so I'm not, Kathy, founding member. So I'm not just trying to push out. We just saying we trying to coordinate everybody. So coordination, mobilization, liberation. So we're not going to sit in doubt and in despair in this moment. We're going to celebrate. We're going to party. We're going to live in joy in the face of these conditions that try to take us out. We know that we have a blueprint and a vision for something greater. And so in the face of that, we will come together and be something better in our future than we could have imagined in our past. So we say that, we thank you, we appreciate you. Please come to another SSJ party. We out here, we will keep being out here. Again, we thank our panelists and our convener, and it's a wrap. Thank y'all so much. Be on the lookout for more SSJ events. Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Peace.